Hi, and welcome to Money Reimagined. I'm Michael Casey. Yesterday, there was yet another cryptocurrency-themed hearing on Capitol Hill, this time in front of the House Financial Services Committee. It was a familiar setup, a panel of representatives grilling a hand-selected group of representatives from the industry. We've seen a bunch of these things going right back to some seminal hearings in 2013, which set the tone for regulating Bitcoin. But somehow, this one felt different. Aside from a few hostile congressmen, Brad Sherman of California being the exemplar, there seemed to be a much more openness position to the dialogue and understanding and just getting to know what this is all about. For the most part, the crypto community's assessment was positive and it reflected this new sense of openness. Still, there are countless contentious issues that arose. Regulation remains a major issue for this space. So to unpack it all, we've invited CoinDesk's managing editor of global policy and regulation, Nikhilesh to join us. But first, hi, Sheila. What did you make of yesterday's meeting?
Well, I'm always hesitant to call anything, a turning point, because that seems a little dramatic. And as we know, the attitudes tend to go back and forth depending on what's really hitting the news cycle at any given moment. But I will certainly say that, to your point, this had a very different tone than previous hearings. And I would include actually hearings on big tech as well. We've had a number of tech-related hearings over the course of the past year, let's say. And this was a pretty unusual tenor and tone of the questions. I also think it was fascinating to see who was actually asked to testify this time, like who actually was pulled up in front of this group of the House Financial Services Committee to provide the kind of detail they were looking for. So you had a couple of CEOs, well, all CEOs, of course, but you had people that really understood the inner workings of the company from a technical perspective, from a kind of regulatory perspective as well. And I think we got into more of those details this time than we kind of had in the past either. So overall, I think it's safe to say it was a good day for crypto, and we should all be looking ahead, I think, with some optimism as to what may follow.
Cool. Well, we've got just the right person to tell us what to be looking forward to going ahead. Nobody knows, I think, really, certainly from the journalism side, much more than Nick Day on, what is going on. So, Nick, what were your major takeaways from yesterday's hearings?
Hey, yeah, it definitely seemed like a very substantive hearing. A lot of these, as Sheila just said, a lot of these tend to be kind of, Congress taking shots at individuals that they believe to have, violated the trust or, business principles or messed up in some way, shape, or form. And we've seen that even during past crypto hearings, in particular with the Libra announcement back when that was a thing that Congress was looking into deeply. But yesterday's hearing really completely different tone. All the questions were substantive, even when, the questions were kind of getting into specific concerns, they were still legitimate concerns. There were concerns about the environment. There were concerns about fees imposed on users. A lot of the questions were also just about, how a specific type of policy might be implemented, whether, a specific type of model such as bank charters made sense, or is there a better alternative? Is there a specific technical concern within, for example, stablecoin issuance? A lot of these questions were very much focused on, trying to elicit genuine answers, substantive answers, rather than just get an emotional response.
The other thing I noticed, Nick, was that this was less partisan than previous hearings. Again, also just on technology writ large. Was that your sense too?
Yeah, absolutely. In past hearings, we've seen very occasionally one party say, okay, we're just going to be very pro regulation, and another party say we're going to be very pro innovation, and never shall the two meet. Yesterday, I think members of both parties said, well, we think that this is cool technology, we think that these are cool use cases. Here are some concerns we have about consumer protection, about financial stability, about making sure that your technology platform or your finance platform doesn't fail at the wrong moment and harm people. And we're trying to talk to you about how to implement rules and regulations around this so that we don't harm the innovation while still protecting consumers. And that was, I think, a trend throughout most of the hearing from almost every member who spoke.
So I was just picking up on what Sheila said the outset about how this differentiated from the sort of the hearings we've seen on big tech as well. I thought it was quite striking, Maxine Waters, the chair of the committee, her sort of opening the whole thing with a rather kind of open, okay, we're here to learn type of perspective on things, in stark contrast to the extremely hard position she took on Facebook's Libra, as it was then called. What's going on there? And is there any sort of sign, I suppose, that there's an openness to this industry being, one that is driven by startups and sort of newcomers, rather than it being owned by, big bad Facebook, I suppose?
Yeah, I think there's really two things happening here. One, as you pointed out, Facebook has this kind of unique position in Congress right now where I don't think there's anyone who really likes Facebook or thinks that they're doing a good job. And part of that is because of the sheer number of, data breaches and privacy breaches and, concerns like the Cambridge Analytica scandal that have, proliferated over the past couple of years. And part of that is just, some pretty real concerns and some imagined concerns about content moderation and how to address, questions about the best way to approach this. So Facebook in and of itself is kind of in this really, negative position. They could announce, that they completely solved world hunger, and I think there'd still be concerns and questions about it. But separately from that, the digital asset sector definitely, I think, is getting a proper look. And, even some of the companies that are involved, Coinbase, for example, was one of the companies that was present yesterday, and it's as close as we can get to a full-blown incumbent enterprise level entity in this sector. And while there were some questions about fees and consumer protection, it was still treated the same as many of the other startups. So, yeah, I think that the digital asset sector in and of itself is being looked at with, if not fresh eyes, at least, very neutralized, very, questioning eyes, rather than, hey, are you trying to destabilize the world financial system?
Did you get a sense, Nick, and I ask this not in a leading way, like genuinely, because this is something that just occurred to me, certainly we've talked a lot on this show about the positioning of the US versus other jurisdictions. So is there a response or reaction to China or to the kind of the growth of fintech in ASEAN? Is there awareness of things like remittances and the amount of money that's kind of flowing from the US to other countries? And is any of that playing in here? But it was interesting kind of who was chosen and who was not, right? So you did have a slate of people who represented, I think, companies that are identified as American, I would say. I think that's a reasonable thing to say, more than I'd say global companies, maybe. And that might be an assessment that those individuals agree with, but I do think that those were kind of seen as Americans testifying about really American HQ'd companies. So that was really interesting. And I didn't get a sense that they were thinking about this globally at all. The tenor of the hearings to me seemed very focused on the US, not the US versus some other country, which is interesting, right? Because I think given all the kind of sturm and drang we've had about China and, digital dollar versus digital yuan and all of that, didn't hear a lot of that come up. Was that your take as well?
Yeah, I actually don't think I heard the digital yuan come up at all.
Yeah.
And yeah, there were definitely questions about, is there concern about companies fleeing the US or setting up shop elsewhere? But you're right, it was really focused on the US's role within its own borders and not how exactly the US is going to compete with, central bank digital currencies from different countries or jurisdictions from different countries. It was just, can we build this here and what do we need?
And I did think it seemed to me that reflected maybe a newer, enhanced understanding of the differences in digital currencies, right? Because it was not a CBDC hearing. And I think that it was interesting because I think when we had earlier hearings on this topic, there was a bit of a eliding of the concept of digital currency, digital dollar versus stablecoin versus crypto and this kind of thing. And here, I think it seemed to me, at least based on the questions asked, that the members really did have a pretty good handle on the differences among these types of offerings and what they were. And I think we saw that with Circle and USDC, for example. There was some sort of questions about that versus some, maybe we'll call them crypto, kind of pure, if you will, crypto kinds of concepts here as well. So yeah, I don't know, Michael, if you noticed that too, and if you have any thoughts on that, because it is really interesting. It was an interesting shift.
No, again, yet another sign that people are starting to do their homework, right? I think there's been a lot of aid to these lawmakers who have put in a bunch of work over the last year or so and has brought them up to speed. They're getting some of that nuance. But I mean, the big issue here, though, Nick, is like again, what is the framework for regulating stablecoins going to look like? And I think, to Sheila's point, understanding how they fit within what the priorities are for the United States, whether it's a CBDC or it's something more along the lines of a privately run model, is vital to how that's all shakes out. Did you get any sense from the hearing, at least from the tone of the question, the type of questions, where lawmakers are leaning at this stage with regards to, will stablecoins require bank charters or not, and all those sort of finer details that seem so important to the sector right now?
Yeah, and this is where I think the crypto industry probably can, if not breathe a sigh of relief, at least take a little bit of comfort. There were questions about this, but a lot of the questions were along the lines of, does the president's working group for financial markets recommendation that stablecoin issuers be treated as banks make sense, or is there another model that would make more sense? Lawmakers were asking Circle CEO Jeremy Allaire and Paxos CEO Charles Cascarilla, do you agree with the idea that there should be mandatory reporting requirements? Should there be other types of tools or other types of requirements that would make more sense? So there really was a genuine effort, it seemed, to get input from stablecoin issuers and from crypto exchanges and these parties to say, here's how we think this could work in practice. Here's what is possible for us. Brian Brooks, the former acting controller, former Binance US CEO, and current Fury CEO, said that it doesn't make sense to require bank charter-like regulations without also granting bank charters. So, the question could become, should there be a path to getting these charters, or how to, what's the another way to approach this? So a lot of the questions about stablecoins were along those lines. There were a couple questions about protections and consumer protections again, but as far as the regulatory regime goes, it does seem like lawmakers really want not just industry input on what they would like to see, but more specifically what is possible and what would be needed, or what would need to happen for them to be able to actually do this. So what would they need to comply?
It's one thing I've been thinking about, to go back to kind of this global concept, is imagining what regulators in other parts of the world are taking away from this particular hearing. Because of course, there's a lot of audience for this stuff. And in the past, there's been this kind of healthy debate, I think, within the crypto community, like, is everyone going to follow what the US does? So if the US were to ban something, is that going to lead to a rash of bans, around the world? And I've been a little bit skeptical about that, because I haven't necessarily I've actually felt like in some cases, there are some jurisdictions that actually would see an opportunity if the US were to do something as, outrageous in my view, as completely stifle this innovation. I think others would step in and say, here's a chance for us to build a gigantic part of the digital economy and be very welcoming to some of these builders and others. But as the tenor shifts, I think, a little bit to, I'm not going to say it's like positive, but certainly open. I think we can agree that it's definitely an open, more open-minded tone than I think we've seen from some of these members in the past. I'm curious if my views on that kind of shift as well. Like, I do think if the US is demonstrating a rigorous process and comes up with a regulatory regime that, is based on this kind of open inquiry, and is more pro-innovation, I think we actually will see a lot of pickup by other jurisdictions from this. And I liken this a little bit, Michael, we had this little episode at one point on charity laws, the concept of 501c3, which many countries have just literally copied. They call it something else, but it's the exact same language. And I do think we could see that happening here if we ultimately get to that point. But I'm curious, Nick, what your take is. Do you think there's going to be competition in the regulatory market, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, or do you think that there's going to be a little bit of a copycat kind of vibe going on?
I think right now it's going to be patchwork for a little bit, for sure. Mm-hmm. And, when we're talking about the international realm, a lot of the questions about regulations come down to a lot of the concerns about financial crime. So ransomware attacks, for example, is a big one that we've been talking about for most of this year. And there is a ongoing push to find a way to harmonize, regulations and laws around ransomware payments, in particular with crypto, but also non-crypto. But it's kind of, it's being put into this broader conversation about, can countries collectively ban these payments or collectively find a way to disincentivize these payments? And I think whatever the US does with crypto, if there is any copying, it's going to be focused a lot on, the protection and crime aspect rather than, the encouraging innovation. I think the encouraging innovation side of these laws might just happen organically as each country kind of grapples with this. And we're seeing that already with places like South Korea and Japan, where they are implementing their own laws that are either requiring licenses to be granted or otherwise forcing some kind of registration regime. And we're starting to see this pop up a little bit in a couple other jurisdictions.
Nick, I think this is the biggest challenge. It always has been in some respects that the industry faces, right? Is that the conversation around the real advantages for the average person here run up against the existing regulatory regime around money laundering, around crime, right? I mean, and it was interesting yesterday, I think you noted that I think the prepared remarks from quite a number of the industry representatives land straight into financial inclusion as a use case, right? We're going to get more and more of the poor having access because they, can more easily access bank accounts and so forth. The flip side of that, in some respects, right, not everything, but in some respects, is because of the fact that they don't need to comply with this sort of rigorous, heavy financial regulatory framework that has been built around, the Bank Secrecy Act and FinCEN, and then sort of the FATF and all these huge surveillance mechanisms that we have spent oodles of time on this program talking about as a barrier to inclusion, right? So it, to me, is where the rubber meets the road in many respects. I wonder whether the smartest thing to do is to step up and say, yay, financial inclusion, we can fix this, because it sounds hollow if it doesn't deliver, without really just getting into the heart of, do we need KYC regimes to be absolutely pervasive and surveilling as they are? Did that conversation get to that level of sophistication, or is it still this bromides of, hey, financial inclusion, and no, we're not going to commit any crimes, but no one really actually acknowledging the inherent conflict in that position?
So interestingly, that actually did not come up. The arguments made in, saying crypto can support financial inclusion were along the lines of, stablecoin issuers don't have minimum, account maintenance requirements or maintenance fees, which banks might have. So, in my eye, I'm actually not sure that that's like a crypto specific thing. It seems to me that if there was a bank that was willing to allow a minimum balance of 0 or waive, maintenance fees, they could probably, make that exact same argument and find success. So I'm not sure that that is a crypto specific thing, but you're right. That is a argument that pervaded a lot of the hearing, is crypto companies saying we can aid in financial inclusion by XYZ. But no, they did not get, that deep into the KYC requirements or issues of that nature.
Well, I mean, let me put it another way. Are lawmakers themselves buying the argument, right? Did you feel as if there was an acceptance of this idea that these guys did have a solution for financial inclusion, which is obviously targeted at the progressives who, have a very vocal voice within the House?
I honestly don't think so. Especially, I don't think the progressives bought that argument, and most of them didn't even ask about it. The lawmakers who did ask, they asked about it, and they were kind of center right level type of politicians, but no one came out there and said, I think this is a perfect solution, or I think this makes a lot of sense. They just said, they asked like, how would this work, and moved on. So to the folks who are making this argument, I think they probably have some more work to do, and probably have to be able to demonstrate how they can do it in practice, because at this point, it has been a couple of years since a lot of these projects launched, and at some point, lawmakers will want to see results, or at least proof of an ability to get those results.
Yeah, well, I certainly think that they're going to want to see an evidence base if it's something as serious as raising standards of living, or making things easier for those who are cut out of the system or excluded in some other way. And I personally think that that's reasonable. We don't want to be building and doubling down on solutions that aren't actually addressing real problems or aren't actually working. That being said, I think there are such solutions. I think it's interesting. This is where the kind of global thing comes into play, because a lot of the solutions that I think are in production are not necessarily in the United States. And so an interesting question is going to be whether those are compelling arguments. Like you could talk about, we had an episode on Axie in the Philippines, right? You could talk about play to earn models. You talk about all kinds of things that I think are interesting, but they aren't necessarily, again, catching fire here in the US the way they are in other parts of the world. And so a lot of the examples I think that some of these folks I suspect would have raised would not take place within the US country border. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how that plays out over the course of time, because as we kind of see an expansion potentially of that particular argument aimed, I would say, at progressives who are needing to be brought along, certainly during this administration and during this particular Congress. So I'm curious, Nick, when it comes to policy, so maybe we can zoom way out. The purpose of these hearings, right? So we all kind of infer, and many of us have conversations behind the scenes with aides or others. This was clearly a hearing focused on education, asking some real questions, really trying to dive into substance, versus some hearings that I think are easy to distinguish, which are really more about creating talking points or maybe more political in nature. And so, what do you think happens now? What's your crystal ball?
I think that this is probably in and of itself not going to directly lead to legislation. We're not going to see a proposal next week that's based purely on this hearing, but this does seem like a first step almost in getting to that point where at some point next year, I imagine we're going to have plenty more hearings, and a lot of them are going to be like yesterday's, where they're focused, just on education. They're going to be focused on broad issues. There could be some that are, very narrowly tailored to addressing stablecoins or custody or specific issues that are within this crypto niche that lawmakers have to grapple with. But at some point next year, we'll probably start seeing legislation proposed that addresses a lot of these questions and either answers the crypto industry's questions about how they can operate without falling afoul of the SEC or the CFTC. And some of them are just going to be focused on protecting users and making sure that customers can for example, exit out of their crypto positions during moments of peak volatility, or avoid paying high fees on transactions. And I don't have a sense of what that timeline looks like yet. It's probably going to be quite a while, and we also have the midterm elections coming up next year, so that's going to slow things down, I imagine. Once that kicks off in full by the end of spring, early summer. So either we have stuff happening in the first half of the year, or we're gonna have to wait a little bit and see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Nick, there were some colorful moments yesterday as well. First of all, I was, again, the quality of the questions, that was one of the things that was striking. I do think that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's question exposed her as somebody who's really done her homework. I mean, yeah. she asked a question about how important stable coins are to the plumbing of the exchanges and the functioning of how payments are made between and around exchanges, which is quite a deep understanding of the functioning of these things. Everybody's favorite crypto hater, though, Brad Sherman, came out with some colorful references. He was talking about hamster coins and mongoose coins, and I think there's been some upshot of that, right?
Yeah, he made a joke about how, I think, quote, the number one threat to crypto is crypto. And he was talking about examples of, cryptocurrencies that are designed to try and become the next Bitcoin, or at least the next, popular payment tool use case for whatever. And he made a joke about how, Doge could be displaced by hamster coin and Croba coin. And then he made a joke about Mongoose coin that could compete with crypto coin. And most of those, I think, actually might have existed. Mongoose coin did not.
Good chance that something like that's going to exist.
Chances are.
Yeah.
24 hours ago, there was no such thing as Mongoose coin.
Right.
Now there's at least one and probably quite a few Mongoose coins out there. People are putting money into this as a joke. There's like one Twitter account that was like, oh yeah, like this is inspired by lawmakers.
There's a lesson in that for them, right? I mean, because it's so easy to spin it up. You do not need anybody's approval. It's just a word. You can make up your hamster coin in a spot, right? So of course there's going to be a hamster coin if you mention it. Yeah, there's a lot of fun there. But I mean, generally, like, you had, Rashida Tlaib. She sounds like she was, if not as kind of like as, I don't know, cantankerous and quick to stir up things as Sherman. She did sound like she was probably more on the critical side, particularly when it comes to energy issues. Where did that conversation go?
Yeah, so Representative Tlaib had some, I think some fairly real concerns about the environmental impact of cryptocurrencies, and in particular crypto mining. And she cited, the University of Cambridge's data on how much energy is used by, for example, Bitcoin mining. And I know some of these numbers are in dispute by the cryptocurrency industry itself. And Bitcoiners in particular say that Bitcoin mining is becoming more environmentally friendly every year. But at least at the moment, the concerns are, I think, very real. She pointed to the fact that you have, once shuttered power plants that run on coal and I think gas that are coming back to life purely to run crypto miners and not for, any other purpose. And she asked, about possible solutions to that. And, one of the responses was, well, other consensus mechanisms exist. But in the meantime, I think this is a conversation we're going to hear a lot more of, especially as current presidential administration, Joe Biden's administration, starts really tamping down on these environmental concerns. Right? Just yesterday, President Biden signed an executive order trying to make the U.S. carbon neutral within the next couple decades. And if crypto mining is a huge industry in the U.S. and it sticks to old power plants that run on coal and gas and perhaps haven't been updated with relatively newer energy efforts to try and make them more carbon neutral or at least more environmentally friendly, then I imagine they're going to become a pretty popular target for lawmakers who want to say, hey, look at this industry that's wasting power and generating CO2 and methane and all these other byproducts and just killing our atmosphere.
Yeah, listening to this, Nick, it's I'm always struck by how the conversation is sort of fraught on both sides, right? I mean, it seems to me that like Bitcoiners who argue there is no carbon footprint in Bitcoin have their head in the sand. They're just ignoring the reality that it has truly got not only high levels of consumption, but just as importantly, a lot of that is coming from fossil fuels. And on the other side, you've got these critics who just focus on that consumption part and do nothing to recognize that the reality is Bitcoin's not going away. And so how are we going to deal with this? And the reality is also that Bitcoin is interested in renewable energy as a way to save money. So what I'd love to see happen is that there is a rich conversation between the community and the policymaking bodies to try to figure out how, in fact, these systems can come together in the interests of everybody. That's just my 2 cents on this.
So, Nick, it was really interesting that even though they did have Brian Brooks, who, of course, very recently became the CEO of Bitfury, and I actually don't even know the timing of this. Maybe he was asked when he was still at Binance, but it seems to me they knew he was at a mining company. There really weren't questions about mining, and this was a topic that just was kind of outscoped, from the conversation. So it seems to me that what they were really focusing on, and I think AOC's question was kind of emblematic of what they were trying to understand, was the infrastructure. Like how can these new innovations, and if so, can they rather, and if so, how can they create a new financial system? And what is it that what's additive, and what is it that might be challenging about that? But it really wasn't about the energy thing at all, even though they could have done that. Apart from, I think, Representative Tlaib's, sort of light touch kind of question. Was that your sense? Do you think that was deliberate?
Yeah, I don't know if it was deliberate, but there definitely was a heavy emphasis on the infrastructure and kind of, protection details that we talked about earlier. And there was a very, very brief bit on the environmental concerns. And it was really just kind of, Representative Tlaib asked about, explained what her concerns were, asked about alternative consensus mechanisms or other solutions. And then we moved on. The hearing moved on to next lawmaker, and that was really it. But certainly could benefit from a longer dedicated either question and answer session or his own dedicated hearing. But yeah, it's definitely a conversation that I think all stakeholders should be having more, and hopefully find a productive middle ground between burning the world and killing everything, killing the crypto industry.
Well, even if they weren't touching on those topics, Nick, it did seem like quite a lot was covered. It was interesting to watch, and your coverage was excellent. But you haven't stopped yet, right? We have a hearing next week. What's that one all about?
Yeah, that's right. The Senate Banking Committee will be talking about stablecoins next Tuesday, and we haven't gotten a full witness list yet. So far, we just know that Alexis Goldstein of the Open Markets Institute and a professor, whose name I'm blanking on, will be speaking. And I don't think any crypto industry representatives have been named yet, but I have to imagine that if we're talking about stablecoins, then there should be at least one or two stablecoin issuers probably present to speak directly about what it is they're doing. But yeah, that'll be kicking off next Tuesday, and then we'll probably have quite a few hearings next year.
Yep. Okay. Well, we will definitely be staying tuned. Certainly the best thing to keep your finger on the pulse of people. Read Nick's State of Crypto weekly newsletter, an excellent read on all this sort of stuff, but also the ongoing coverage from him and the rest of his team on CoinDesk. Thank you, Sheila, once again for joining us. Always fun. Thank you, Nick. Thank you all for listening. Come back again next week for another edition of Money Reimagined. Bye for now.